Let's call Trump's Iran policy for what it is. Not Trump's Operation Epic Fury, Trump's Operation Epic Failure. That's just what it is. It's an epic failure. 45 days into this war, things are worse than the day Trump started his choice of putting us in war. Let's look at the chart here. Strait of Hormuz, the situation is worse. Iranian regime, situation worse. Gas prices, situation worse. Iran's nuclear ambition, worse. American credibility, worse. What a colossal failure.
All right, folks, Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? Chuck Schumer just forced a war powers resolution onto the Senate floor. Not a press release, not a letter, a binding legislative instrument ordering Trump to halt all offensive military operations against Iran and get congressional authorization before firing another shot.
Now, Mr. President, today, senators face a choice. Stand with the American people who are tired of war in the Middle East, or side with Donald Trump, who bumbles America into another war most Americans fiercely oppose. Voting on matters of war is one of the most solemn votes a senator can take. This is about whether or not senators are ready to send your sons and your daughters into harm's way. If there was ever a moment for Senate Republicans to take a stand, it's now.
Every senator now has to stand up, say their name, and go on permanent record about whether they support a president who posted on social media that an entire civilization would be wiped out by sunrise if his demands weren't met. History is taking attendance. That roll call vote will be studied by constitutional scholars for decades. It will be played in campaign advertisements across every competitive state and district. It will be cited in legal briefs submitted to federal courts wrestling with questions of executive war powers.
For a fourth time, the Senate did not authorize invocation of war powers against President Trump for the war in Iran. I want to turn to Capitol Hill correspondent, congressional reporter Torian Small. Torian, how did it go down?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing time after time when it comes to these war powers resolutions is that there just isn't a bipartisan appetite to really rebuke the president in this way. We've only seen so far one Republican really join with Democrats in this call to rein in the president's war powers, especially as it relates to this conflict with Iran. That's Senator Rand Paul, who's had his tiffs with the president previously, so this wasn't really a surprising vote by him today. But ultimately, we'll see something similar on the House side sometime soon. Representative Gregory Meeks has a war powers resolution that he's looking to move forward. This also comes after Democrats unsuccessfully tried to push through unanimous consent votes on war powers, on a war power resolution during the pro forma session over the past 2 weeks when Congress is out on recess.
It will be referenced by future Congresses confronting future presidents who test the boundaries of their constitutional authority. And most immediately, it will be used by voters heading to the polls to render judgment on who deserves to represent them in the halls of Congress. What elevates this particular vote into genuinely historic territory is not merely that it is occurring, but the extraordinary context in which it arrives.
The Senate failed again this morning to approve a war powers resolution. If passed, the resolution would have forced President Trump to get congressional approval before any more military action against Iran. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to block Iranian ports on the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command says they've turned back 9 vessels with no shots fired. Trump announced the blockade Sunday after negotiations with Iran failed, but he says a new round of negotiations could be happening over the next 2 days.
Those discussions are being had, but nothing is official until you hear it from us here at the White House. But we feel good about the prospects of a deal.
Iranian state media reported that Pakistani delegation landed in Iran today to negotiate a second round of talks with the U.S.
A previous war powers measure targeting the same Iranian conflict already came breathtakingly close to passage. That earlier resolution failed by the narrowest of margins, 53 senators voting against, 47 voting in favor. The mathematics of that outcome are stark and revealing. Rand Paul stood alone among Republicans in crossing the aisle. John Fetterman represented the sole Democratic defection. That is the margin that separates the current state of affairs from a fundamentally transformed constitutional landscape. One additional Republican senator deciding that a president who threatens the annihilation of an entire civilization on live social media has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and the entire resolution flips. One single vote. And multiple Republican senators are now expressing, sometimes publicly, sometimes through carefully calibrated statements to trusted reporters, a growing sense of profound unease about what this war is becoming. They speak about the financial cost, which mounts with every passing day of sustained naval and air operations. They speak about the duration, which has extended far beyond what initial briefings suggested. They speak about the constitutional question that hangs over everything, whether a military campaign of this scope and length can legitimately continue without Congress fulfilling its Article 1 responsibilities. Susan Collins has made a statement that carries particular weight precisely because of who she is and how she chooses her words. She has said, on the record and without ambiguity, that any ground war or any military operation extending beyond 60 days requires congressional approval under the plain terms of the War Powers Resolution. This is not a partisan attack from a progressive firebrand. This is a constitutional observation from a Republican senator with decades of institutional memory, someone who understands precisely what the War Powers Act requires and what the passing of time means for the legal foundation of ongoing military operations. When Susan Collins speaks about the 60-day threshold, she is providing a constitutional framework, not merely a political justification. She is giving other Republicans who may be privately troubled but publicly silent the precise language they need to explain a vote that might otherwise appear as disloyalty to the president. The Supreme Court has already weighed in on a parallel track, and that judicial intervention provides essential context for understanding why this Senate vote carries such transformative potential. The court ruled, with justices appointed by Trump himself joining the majority, that the president's emergency economic powers have constitutional limits. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the executive branch a blank check to rewrite trade policy by decree. Congress retains its constitutional authority over tariffs, and the president exceeded the boundaries of his delegated authority when he attempted to govern through emergency declaration rather than through the legislative process. The Senate War Powers Resolution makes precisely the same argument, applied to a different domain, but rooted in identical constitutional soil. The Constitution vests Congress with the power to declare war and to authorize military action. The War Powers Act establishes specific procedural requirements and temporal limitations on presidential use of military force without congressional authorization. Trump has been conducting an ongoing military campaign without seeking or receiving the constitutionally required authorization. The parallel between the tariff ruling and the War Powers Resolution is not coincidental. It reflects a consistent constitutional principle being asserted by different institutional actors across different policy domains. The president does not possess unlimited unilateral authority, whether in economic policy or in military affairs. Both the judiciary and the legislature are now asserting that principle simultaneously from their respective constitutional positions. The political environment surrounding this vote has been fundamentally transformed by Trump's own words. The March resolution was debated and defeated before the president posted that a whole civilization will die tonight if his demands were not satisfied by a specific deadline. That post changed everything. It transformed what might have been a routine, if contentious, war powers debate into something far more consequential. It raised the stakes for every senator who will have to explain their vote to constituents who watched their commander-in-chief threaten civilizational destruction on social media. It generated international alarm from allies who suddenly questioned whether American military action was being governed by careful strategic calculation or by impulsive rhetorical escalation. It prompted human rights organizations and international legal experts to publicly assess whether language of that nature could potentially constitute incitement to atrocity crimes under established principles of international humanitarian law. Amnesty International, an organization not known for hyperbolic political commentary, described the president's rhetoric in terms that should give every senator pause. The phrase, potentially constituting incitement to atrocity crimes, is not casual political criticism. It is a specific legal assessment made by professionals whose entire institutional purpose is evaluating conduct against established international legal standards. Republican senators who vote against the War Powers Resolution in this environment are not simply voting to continue an unauthorized military campaign. They are voting to continue an unauthorized military campaign being directed by a commander-in-chief whose public statements about that campaign have been professionally assessed as approaching potential war crimes territory. That is a vote that becomes extraordinarily difficult to explain to suburban constituents who have already demonstrated their willingness to abandon MAGA candidates in numbers that should terrify every Republican strategist. The impeachment proceedings running parallel to this Senate vote create a mutually reinforcing dynamic that amplifies the significance of both efforts. More than 70 Democratic members of Congress have formally called for Trump's removal through impeachment or invocation of the 25th Amendment. Representative Larson has filed 13 distinct articles of impeachment covering a range of presidential conduct. The War Powers Resolution and the impeachment push are not separate and unrelated political maneuvers. They are different instruments being deployed in service of the same constitutional argument. The Iran war was launched without congressional authorization. It violates the specific requirements of the War Powers Act. A commander-in-chief who makes civilizational threats without constitutional authority is a president who must be checked by every mechanism the Constitution provides. The War Powers Resolution represents the most direct and constitutionally clean of those mechanisms because it uses precisely the procedure that the Constitution and the War Powers Act established for exactly this situation. If it passes, Congress has asserted its constitutional authority through the process designed for that purpose. If it fails, Democrats will cite that failure as proof that only the more dramatic remedies of impeachment or the 25th Amendment can stop what they characterize as an illegal and potentially catastrophic military campaign. Either outcome advances the larger constitutional accountability argument. A successful vote makes the constraint concrete and enforceable. A failed vote makes the case for more aggressive congressional action more compelling. Trump is trapped between outcomes, neither of which offers him a path to political or constitutional victory. Let us examine the specific mechanics of what this resolution actually accomplishes, because understanding the precise legal and constitutional effects is essential to grasping why this vote matters so profoundly. A War Powers Resolution that secures a Senate majority does not automatically and instantaneously remove Donald Trump from the presidency. It does not cause military operations to cease the moment the final vote is tallied. What it accomplishes is several distinct but interconnected outcomes, each of which carries independent significance. First, it places Congress formally and officially on record, by a majority vote of the United States Senate, declaring that the Iran war was initiated and has been conducted without proper constitutional authorization. That declaration carries legal weight. It becomes part of the legislative history that courts consult when evaluating constitutional questions. It signals to the executive branch that the legislative branch is asserting its constitutional prerogatives. Second, it triggers specific timelines and requirements under the War Powers Act. The statute establishes that unauthorized military operations must cease within a defined period unless Congress provides affirmative authorization. Once the Senate goes on record demanding that cessation, the administration faces a clear choice: comply with the congressional mandate and acknowledge that its war powers claims were overstated, or defy the mandate and generate an immediate and profound constitutional crisis. Third, it provides federal courts with a clear legislative record to consult if and when legal challenges to the war's authorization move through the judicial system. Courts are properly reluctant to intervene in disputes between the political branches without clear evidence that one branch has formally asserted its position. A Senate vote provides that evidence in the most authoritative form available. Fourth, it compels every Republican senator to make an unambiguous public choice between standing with a commander-in-chief who threatens civilizational annihilation and standing with the constitutional principle that Congress, not the president, possesses the power to authorize war. That choice, memorialized forever in the congressional record, is what seals Trump's fate politically. Not because a single Senate vote magically ends his presidency, but because the vote either demonstrates that a bipartisan majority exists to assert constitutional limits on his war powers, which transforms everything about how the remainder of his term unfolds, or it demonstrates that Republicans will protect him even when his conduct reaches the most extreme and constitutionally indefensible territory, which transforms everything about how the midterm elections play out for every Republican whose name appears on that roll call. The mathematics of getting from 53 against to a majority in favor runs through a small and identifiable group of Republican senators whose public statements and private deliberations are being monitored with intense scrutiny. Rand Paul is already positioned in favor of the resolution. His constitutional consistency on war powers questions means he will remain there. Susan Collins has made the 60-day statement, which is as close to a public signal of potential support as a senator typically provides before actually casting a vote. The question now is who else might join them. The Republican senators who voted against the emergency tariff declarations provide an obvious starting point for analysis. McConnell, Tillis, and Murkowski demonstrated on that vote that they are willing to assert constitutional limits on presidential emergency authority when they believe those limits have been genuinely crossed. The question is whether their institutional willingness to apply that principle to economic emergency declarations extends to military emergency escalations. The political calculation is undeniably different. Crossing Trump on tariffs carries one set of political risks. Crossing him on a war carries another, potentially more severe set of risks, because war votes are wrapped in patriotism framing that tariff votes simply do not carry. But the underlying constitutional principle is identical. The president does not get unlimited unilateral authority simply by invoking the word emergency. The civilization-level threat rhetoric changes the political calculus in ways that may prove decisive. Senators who might have been able to vote against the March resolution and hope the issue faded from public consciousness now face a fundamentally different environment. The president's own words have ensured that this vote will receive maximum public attention. Every news organization will cover it. Every late-night host will reference it. Every campaign consultant will clip it for advertisements. The senators expressing concern about the war's financial cost and strategic duration are making arguments that complement the constitutional war powers argument rather than compete with it. When Republican senators talk about the price tag of sustained military operations, they are talking about costs that manifest in their states' economies, in defense spending that displaces other priorities, in oil price fluctuations that affect their constituents' household budgets. Those economic concerns, combined with genuine strategic uncertainty about the war's ultimate objectives and exit strategy, create a political environment where voting for the war powers resolution can be framed not merely as a constitutional check on presidential overreach, but as a responsible fiscal and strategic decision that directly serves constituent interests. That dual framing, constitutional principle plus constituent benefit, is precisely the kind of argument that can move senators who have been reluctant to break with Trump on purely constitutional grounds. It gives them a way to explain their vote that resonates beyond the narrow band of constitutional scholars and war powers enthusiasts. It connects the abstract constitutional question to the concrete economic reality their voters experience every day. The convergence of the Supreme Court's tariff ruling and this war powers vote tells a single coherent story about the limits of governance by emergency decree. The court has already said that emergency economic powers are not unlimited. The Senate is now being asked to say that emergency military powers are not unlimited. These are not separate stories. They are chapters in the same constitutional narrative. A president who believed he could govern through emergency declarations across every policy domain is discovering that the Constitution's allocation of powers among the branches cannot be circumvented simply by invoking the rhetoric of crisis. The courts are pushing back in the economic domain. Congress is pushing back in the military domain. The principle is consistent across both. The institutional actors are different, but their constitutional arguments are identical. And the senators who found the courage to assert legislative authority on tariffs are now being asked to find that same courage on war. This convergence is what elevates the moment from routine political conflict to genuine constitutional reckoning. It is not merely that Trump faces opposition from Democrats who never supported him. That has been true since his first day in office. It is that he faces opposition from his own Supreme Court appointees, from Republican senators who have defended him through countless previous controversies, from institutional actors who have every political incentive to support him but are finding that their constitutional obligations pull in a different direction. The impeachment dimension adds another layer of significance to this vote. The 70-plus House members calling for removal, the 13 articles filed by Representative Larson, the broader Democratic argument that Trump's conduct has crossed constitutional lines that require the most serious congressional response, all of this exists in dynamic relationship with the War Powers Resolution. If the resolution passes, it demonstrates that the constitutional system's normal mechanisms for checking presidential war powers remain functional. If it fails, it strengthens the argument that only the extraordinary mechanisms of impeachment or the 25th Amendment can provide the necessary check. Either outcome shapes how the broader accountability conversation unfolds. A passed resolution makes the case for impeachment slightly less urgent because Congress has demonstrated its capacity to constrain the president through ordinary legislative means. A failed resolution makes the case for impeachment more compelling because it suggests that ordinary legislative means are insufficient when the president's own party refuses to enforce constitutional limits. Trump understands this dynamic intuitively, even if he could not articulate it in constitutional terms. He knows that a Senate vote constraining his war powers, even if it does not immediately halt military operations, represents a fundamental shift in the political landscape. It signals to every other Republican officeholder that breaking with the president on constitutional grounds is survivable. It signals to his own administration that Congress is watching and is prepared to assert its authority. It signals to the courts that the legislative branch has taken a formal position on the constitutional question, which gives judges more comfort in intervening. And it signals to the international community that American military action in Iran does not enjoy unified domestic political support, which has its own diplomatic and strategic consequences. The Republican senators who are genuinely undecided about this vote face an excruciating set of calculations. Voting yes means facing the immediate and intense fury of Trump's political operation, potential primary challenges from MAGA-aligned candidates, and the full force of a social media ecosystem that will brand them as traitors and enemies of the president. Voting no means attaching their name permanently to a roll call that will be used against them in every competitive general election they ever face. In a political environment where suburban voters are already abandoning Republican candidates in numbers that have transformed the electoral map. The senators who have been expressing concern about cost and duration are trying to create space for a different kind of vote. They are signaling to their colleagues and to the political world that there are legitimate, nonpartisan reasons to support the resolution. They are building a permission structure for Republicans who want to vote yes, but fear the political consequences. They are providing the rhetorical framework that allows a yes vote to be explained as fiscal responsibility and strategic prudence rather than as disloyalty to the president. Whether that framework proves sufficient to move the necessary 4 votes remains the central question. The civilization-level threat rhetoric has made that question more urgent and more visible. Senators who might have voted no in March and hoped no one noticed now understand that everyone will notice. The president's own words have ensured that this vote will receive maximum public attention. The Amnesty International assessment, the international legal commentary, the diplomatic alarm from allies, all of it combines to create an environment where a no vote carries weight that it simply did not carry when the March resolution was considered. Every senator casting a no vote in this environment is making a choice that will be explained and defended and attacked for the remainder of their political careers. They will be asked in debates and interviews and town halls why they voted to continue an unauthorized war being conducted by a commander-in-chief whose rhetoric about that war has been professionally assessed as potentially inciting atrocity crimes. That is a question that is very difficult to answer in a way that satisfies suburban voters who are already skeptical of MAGA governance. And those suburban voters are precisely the constituency that has been driving the dramatic electoral swings that have Republicans terrified about their prospects. The connection to the midterm elections is direct and unavoidable. Democrats are already signaling that every Republican vote against the war powers resolution will become a central feature of their campaign advertising. The ads will write themselves. A clip of Trump threatening civilizational annihilation, followed by a clip of the Republican senator explaining why they voted to continue that war without congressional authorization, followed by a narrator asking whether that senator represents the Constitution or represents Donald Trump. In districts and states where suburban voters are already moving away from Republicans, that message could be devastating. Republicans will counter with their own framing. They will argue that Democrats are playing politics with national security, that the resolution is a partisan stunt designed to undermine a commander-in-chief during ongoing military operations, that the proper forum for challenging presidential war powers is not a rushed Senate vote, but the ordinary appropriations and authorization processes. These arguments will resonate with some voters, particularly the base Republican voters who remain intensely loyal to Trump. But the question is whether they resonate with the marginal voters who decide close elections, the suburban moderates who care about process and norms and constitutional limits, even when they do not agree with Democratic policy positions. The outcome of this vote, whatever it is, will shape the political landscape for everything that follows. A past resolution demonstrates that bipartisan constitutional constraints remain operative, and that breaking with Trump on fundamental questions is politically viable. A failed resolution demonstrates that the Republican Party is institutionally incapable of checking presidential overreach, even when that overreach reaches the level of threatening civilizational destruction without congressional authorization. Both outcomes have consequences. Both outcomes will be cited and debated and litigated for years to come, and both outcomes will be used by voters to decide who deserves to represent them. The Senate is about to vote. The names are about to go on the record. The roll call will be preserved forever in the congressional record and in the collective memory of a nation watching to see whether its constitutional system still functions as designed. Every senator will have to decide whether they stand with the Constitution or with the commander-in-chief who threatens civilizational annihilation without congressional authorization. That decision, once made and recorded, seals the political fate of everyone whose name appears on that roll. There is no hiding from this vote. There is no explaining it away after the fact. There is only the stark choice, the public record, and the judgment of history and voters alike.